Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jose, and today we're just covering flashes. We're covering flash photography. We're gonna keep it fairly simple. There was a video recently that was left on my channel asking if I could make a video about flash photography and kind of some of the do's and don'ts and how it all works. And so that's what I'm gonna do. We're gonna cover all the general basics that I think you need to know for flash photography. We're gonna cover some common problems that you might run into, how to troubleshoot those problems, as well as like different setups, right? Because there's more than one way to use a flash. And so we're gonna cover kind of the basic methods that I would recommend for using one of these things. Now, kind of to get the obvious out of the way is I'm assuming a few things if you're watching this video. I am assuming that you have your own flash, that you have an external flash on you. Now, a lot of cameras do have a flash built into them, especially if it's like a more beginner style camera, but that's not what we're covering. We're covering something that looks like these bad boys, an external flash that you can put onto your camera. Now, if you were looking to getting one, I'm not gonna cover like the best flashes of all time to get, but I will give you an easy recommendation. If you search up your camera brand and search up Godox, G-O-D-O-X, this video is not sponsored in any way, but I've been using these Godox flashes like straight for the past 5 years. I've put easily over 100,000 photos through flashes on Godox stuff. They're reliable. They're not the best on the market, but they're pretty good for the money. Now, they're not super cheap either. They're probably closer to like 200 bucks, depending on what model you get. Maybe it's 100, maybe it's 300. If you're on a budget, find something used like on Facebook Marketplace. But just literally look up like if you've got a Nikon Godox flash, a Canon Godox flash, a Sony Godox flash, and just kind of browse through that brand and find whatever is in your budget. So I'm gonna assume you have a flash. The model that we're using today, in case you're wondering like what exactly is this, the V863S, but most of Godox flashes are pretty good. Okay, cool. Onto the basics. Now, first things first, obviously, we have to get, again, the fundamentals out of the way, because if we cover everything, then we'll be on the same page. So, first of all, make sure your flash turns on, right? Make sure that it works, right? Make sure it's charged, that the batteries are good, whether it's double A's or the built-in ones, kind of like what we have here. Make sure it connects to your camera too. A lot of the times you can kind of tell if it's a good connection, because a lot of the modern flashes will turn on with your camera. It should give you certain settings for reading, one of them being like aperture. And so if I move my aperture on my camera, it is reading on my flash as well. So there's good data connection, there's good power connection too, and so information is being transferred. So make sure that your flash is working. And then one last thing before I get you stuck on this video and it's not what you're looking for, we are not covering off camera flash. We're not covering the flashes that you put on sticks, we're just covering on your camera. And 95% of the events I've shot has just been on camera flash. And so I think this is a really great way to just do whatever you need to without doing anything crazy and spend more money on stands and other flashes. So just on camera flash. Okay, now on to how to actually use this thing. Okay, so now we're covering kind of the modes in your flash, and depending on the model, this can kind of depend, but for my experience, there are really two main modes on most modern flashes. First of all flashes, wherever they were made, will have a manual mode. And so this is a mode that, depending on the model, you can change the numbers on. Now, I have a Godox flash, and so my manual mode might look different than you. It's gonna show you a couple numbers. It's gonna show you like 1/32nd, 1/64th, right? Think of that as a measurement of time, because it is a measurement of time, and that's what it's telling you. And so if you're at one half second, right, that's a longer period of time than 1/28th of a second, right? The bigger the fraction number, the smaller the number is, right? And so don't think of it like, oh, it's a bigger number, so it's a longer time. No, the shorter the number, the smaller the number, right? We're thinking of like 1/128th, 1/256th, right? These are smaller fractions. The flash won't shoot for as long, and it won't add as much light to the scene. Versus if you're at 1/8 of a second, 1/4 of a second, that is a larger number in terms of like fractions. And so that just means that the flash is firing for longer, and so that's the equivalent of walking in the rain versus running through it. And so really we won't cover manual mode too much because it is not my favorite mode. That's more of a backup. But in the event that you're your other modes don't work, you can refer back to manual. And my recommendation is just take a photo with the settings that you want on your camera. Don't change the camera settings for your flash yet. Just shoot whatever you want. And if it's too dark, then make the number like proportionally bigger. So if you're at 1/16th, make it 1/8, right? Make it half. If that more, then 1/4, then add more, 1/2. And then if you need to go 1 second to full flash, you can, just to make sure that the image is adequately lit. Now, and same thing on the opposite end. If your image is too bright, like if the flash is shooting too much light into the scene, then make the number smaller, right? Make it from 1/16th to 1/32nd, 1/64th, and kind of just keep going until that light comes down on your scene, and you know, and your subject is adequately lit. Now, in my scenarios, for example, I do a lot of wedding photography. I don't have the time to test and different scenarios, a lot of stuff. I just don't have the time. And so the other mode that I'm going to cover that is on most modern flashes, I would say, especially if they're for your camera, is called TTL. Now, TTL stands for through the lens metering. And really all it is, think of it like an auto mode. Now, I know you might have been taught like, oh, I shouldn't shoot in auto on my camera. That is true. But modern equipment nowadays has gotten really good that we can do auto on some stuff. I mean, we do autofocus, right? And so we can do auto flash settings as well. So all TTL is it connects to your camera and it looks at what your camera is looking at, and then from there it decides how much flash it should actually shoot. So it literally does it for you. Now, TTL or some cameras, I know Canons, they're called eTTL, maybe electronic through the lens, whatever. It should say some version of TTL or an auto mode. They rely on your settings. So whenever you change your camera settings, don't expect a darker image because the flash will shoot for longer to compensate. But to like keep it simple, TTL is auto. That's what we're gonna mainly cover throughout this whole video. But there's one more, depending on the type of flash that you have, called multi. Now, multi, all it is it just fires flashes in quick succession. It lets the camera know, and it lets you know, like, hey, if we're shooting something that we need to get, and it's a fast-moving subject or something that we need multiple shots of in that scene because we might miss it, multi is the way to go. Now, I really don't mess with multi because I'm not a sports photographer or anything like that, so I don't need to get certain shots. I'm not like a paparazzi, so I just stick with TTL because it's the fastest to use. It's fairly consistent, especially with the methods that I'm going to show you. But I still know how to use manual, right? Because in certain areas or events or situations, I do need to switch over to manual. But for now, we are using TTL. So now let's talk about it. So like I mentioned real quick, TTL just reads the settings on your camera and it will compensate. So if let's say if your image is one stop too dark, right, or one stop too bright, the camera will add or subtract one stop on the power that it outputs in order to compensate for the image. Now, one thing to kind of keep in mind is it does this through a few methods. One, it reads the information coming from your camera. So that's why I mentioned like having a good connection is important, as well as getting preferably the brand, the flash for your brand of camera. Because if you get another brand, it might not work as well, if not at all. Now, the manual will almost always work, but TTL auto might not. And so make sure that the information is going through accurately. Second is, because it is on auto mode, that doesn't mean we can't change any settings, right? It doesn't mean like, oh, the image is too bright and the auto's gonna mess up, so what? No, like, so there are certain buttons on the flashes. For now, I'm just gonna use the V860 as an example. There's a plus and minus symbol. If I click on that and then I move it, I can add or subtract the amount of power that it gives. So I get like a +1, a +1.7, or a -2. And so that's like negating 2 stops of light. So maybe I shoot it on TTL, shoot it on auto, and the camera is still, like, the image is still too bright. I can then decrease it because maybe there's it's backlit, or there's a bright spot on the image that I don't really care if it's overexposed, but the camera does. Well, I can tell the camera, look, do what you're doing, just 2 stops darker, right? This is the look I'm going for. Because some people want overexposed, some people want underexposed. So You can still change the auto, just let it know, hey, bring it down, whatever level you're shooting at, bring it down by this measurement, or raise it up or whatever you need to. And you know, every flash is different, so my recommendation is you don't need to look through the manual. It helps, but manuals are hard to read through every now and then, and so I would just, you know, look up a video on the flash and just kind of see how people are using it, or just try it out. I don't think enough people are sitting and actually testing their equipment and seeing what works for them and what doesn't. So but speaking about testing and methods, let's talk about how I use the flash and kind of you know, some methods that I recommend that you use it for your photography. All right, so there's two ways to use your camera flash. And so obviously, you know, like we mentioned, you know, plug it into your camera, make sure it's reading and everything. Now, I don't actually need this on there. Just for my sake, it'll be easier to just hold this. But, you know, use the flash, have it on your camera. Most flashes, don't be scared to do it, but you can bend them and you can twist them. And this is for a few reasons. Because there are different methods to use the flash, and so it allows for all methods. One of the methods is, and you've seen this everywhere, is directly at the subject. So I'm not going to point it at you because seizure warning, so I'm going to point it at myself. So this flash is going to be aimed directly at me, and so this is just directly to the subject. So right, like that's directly to your subject. Now there are a few things that I don't love about this. Is it's really hard on the eyes. Like if you're taking photos during a wedding or during like a portrait session, like that's a lot. Like that is. But it does give like sometimes an editorial look or like a party look. And depending on how your flash set up, especially like if you have an off-camera flash, that looks a little bit better. But I think that pointing it at the subject is kind of should be a last resort. Now some people like that look. I don't. So what I do is instead of pointing it at the subject and blinding them constantly with the amount of photos that I take, I point it up. So I bend this thing and I point it straight at the ceiling, and I fire my flash. And so why should we use what do you call bounce flash instead of direct flash? So I'm not gonna lie, that is a less common method of shooting with flash. But here are the advantages in my opinion, and this is why I only bounce my flash up whenever I'm using flash for photography. One of the reasons is that I want a very flattering image, right? And so the more time you give light to diffuse, the better it looks. And so I'm gonna have a few examples of me actually using it during a reception and kind of some photos. But for anything, whether it's people, whether it's plants and reception details, flash bounced up is not only more visually appealing, at least for me, but it's less harsh on the eyes. It's not as hard on your subjects and your guests, and people are, because of that, they're more likely to party and they're more likely to have fun. Same thing on your portrait sessions. People are less likely to be like, ugh, like you don't see in their face as much, and they're more comfortable when they're taking their portraits. Now, while I do recommend bounce flash, you know, point it at the ceiling and literally just point it straight up. Now, keep in mind though, when you're using it, right, like on a camera, right, if you go from landscape to portrait, that flash is no longer aiming at the ceiling. So I always like to kind of turn my flash sideways so I can always aim up. And then when I turn my camera, I can just, sorry. So back to the example. Whenever I do this, right, I'm taking photos, and then when I go sideways to take a portrait, I just move it up. And so it's become second nature to me. Like I literally just, okay, boom, boom, boom. It should be simple, and after doing that enough, you'll feel comfortable to where you don't even have to worry about it. Now, what are situations you should use this inside, and what situations shouldn't? Well, inside, like I mentioned, this method only works when there's a ceiling to reflect it back. So if you're outside, this does not work, obviously, because that flash light goes up and it does not come back down. So having a nice like white ceiling, which 90% of buildings does help. Now, some situations where this might not work, barn weddings, or big wood, you know, especially if it's dark wood and if it's triangular. What happens with triangular situations is that light gets in there and it gets stuck. It does not come back down, right? A flat ceiling will send that light back down, but triangles and triangular ceilings will eat light and they'll keep it in those corners. So barn, triangular barns will eat light. Any wood structures generally don't like to send light back to you. It's more of like white ceilings. And I mention white specifically because black ceilings eat light, right? Black absorbs light, and so it doesn't reflect it back as easily. So you might run into a situation, where you're shooting on auto and you send the light up and it's still really dark. Then maybe consider bumping your flash TTL, like I mentioned earlier, setting the auto mode higher. Like sometimes in some venues, I have to set it to +3 stops just to get a usable image that I like. But that takes up a lot of power. And so maybe sometimes then I do point it at the person, or maybe I just stick to manual. But for 80-90% of the venues that you're at, or locations, or if you're indoors, you're in most rooms, pointing it at the ceiling should be enough. Okay, so we covered TTL flash versus like auto, and pointing it up versus pointing it at your subjects. When should we use what? Well, if you have enough time, right? If you're doing something like a portrait session or anything like that indoors, consider using manual, because you can test it and you can really fine tune it. I think understanding manual is important because that's your backup, right? If your auto mode doesn't work, you need to know how to use your manual because you still need those photos. Now, if you're indoors, I still really do recommend bouncing your flashlight up instead of directly at your subject. Again, it's not as aggressive. I think that's really important for me, is putting people at ease when they're taking photos. We're not all models. We're not like naturally inclined to be in front of a camera. And so to get good photos outside of just being a good photographer, you also have to be a good people person, make people feel comfortable, especially by not pointing flashes at them. So point it up is my recommendation if you're indoors. Now, if it's like a really dark room and dark ceiling, if your flash has a type of modifier, especially the ones built in, so this is like a little white box paper thing that I can let go from the camera flash, this will literally send light towards your subject. So this is way better than, in my opinion, than pointing your flash at them directly. This white card will bounce light in as it's going out of the flash and a little bit towards your subject. Now, it's not as great or as obvious as like directly on it, but it does help a little bit. And depending on the situation, I do this. Now, if we want to take it one step further, depending on how the room is or wherever you're at, consider shooting near a corner. If the corner is like a white wall, for example, the walls behind me, if that was a black ceiling and I'm getting no light in the middle of the room, as I get closer to the corner, those walls will start to reflect light back into my subject. And again, I rather have that because it's more diffused, it's not as aggressive, and it still looks decent. So depending on like the lens I'm using or the situation that I'm in, I will go to the edge of the room because that gives me kind of a reflector to send that light back in the room where I need it. And so consider like going to corners or edges of the room. And then lastly is just increase the power of your TTL. Granted, you can do that in manual, but because like if you're moving around or if it's an event or anything, then just increase or decrease as you're going the exposure increments on your TTL. If you need to go to +3, +2, if you need to go to, if it's too bright, like if you're at the corner and you're like, whoa, it's a lot of power, bring it down, like -1.7, whatever you need. And so on top of that, make sure that depending on the flash, like this one does have it asks for your camera's focal length. And so right now I'm on 14 millimeters, but when I put the flash in, it'll be at 50. That just tells the camera flash, hey, this is how far or how close we are to the subject. So power accordingly, right? So try to just let the flash know as much information as you need or as it needs to get a good image. Now, when do we use direct point at your subject flash? Really, the only two situations are A, if the couple specifically requests it, or if my model specifically requests it, or if I want the desired effect. I'd say for me though, it's whenever couples ask for it when they want like an editorial style look, or like Vogue or GQ. That's what's a lot of those photographers kind of aim for when they're going for that look. Now, I don't know if they're lighting their subjects directly, but they're getting pretty close. And so a lot of times if like we want drinks during reception where it's like bride and groom, sipping on their cocktails with each other, she's got like glasses on and he's got his bow tie off and he's looking good, I might point the flash at them because it's more of a party look. It's like someone snapped a Polaroid of them. That, or if I'm outside. If I'm outside, I can't really do anything other than point the flash at them or have an external light, which again, we're not covering in this video, but I just pointed at them. One big example is like a grand exit when bride and groom are done with their wedding and they're walking off and everyone is celebrating them and they're walking through that little tunnel. I have to point my flash at them because usually it's outside whenever that exit happens and there's nothing to bounce that light back into. And I mean, other than that, you know, it's kind of like at your own discretion, right? If you're shooting something that's a little bit more intimate, so for example, like a wedding ceremony is a big one, right? I almost never even use flash for wedding ceremonies, but if I do, I always point it up. And if there's no ceiling, if it's an outdoor ceremony, now I haven't done anything that's outdoor in the middle of the night where it's dark, but in the event I need to, and that comes with communicating with clients and making sure I understand what they need, then I will bring off-camera flash because I do not want to point this flash at them when they're saying their vows and they're saying their I do's, because it's a lot, man. Like it's too much. And so be cognizant. Don't be that annoying photographer with your flash. And so final thoughts. Look, you can mess around with your manual mode. You can mess around with your multi and your off-camera flashes. But look, dude, I've shot with some photographers that have had 5, 6, 7 years of experience, right? That charge twice as much as me for weddings, and they didn't know the auto mode was a thing. And I've used it for all my shoots, you know, if the situation allows for it. So just try it. Like, trust me. Like I make a living off using bounce flash, just pointing at the ceiling, and if the image looks good, then keep it up. Now, if that's not the look you're going for, then you have other options. But that's my look. I like how that looks. It looks flattering. It looks good. And so just consider it, right? Point it up. It's super easy. And even though it's auto, you can still adjust settings. So you really pinpoint, like put it where you want it to be. But again, learn manual mode because it saved me when my auto mode just was not working, and practice or use it, or just, you know, have it with you because you never know when you're gonna need flash. So that's it for the video. There's nothing else that you got to worry about flash other than either point it up, maybe point it at your subject, making sure that, you know, depending on the orientation of your camera, that it is, you know, pointing the right way, like I mentioned. So if you're trying to use bounce flash, make sure that either you're aiming it up in landscape or aiming it sideways for a portrait. And that is it, guys. Sorry the video looks a little different today. I have removed for those of you who know, my black promise filter, right? That's what it would usually look like before, and that's what it looks like after. So it's a little bit more contrasty. I'm trying to work on getting these highlights a little bit lower, but give me your tips, guys. Give me your recommendations. If you guys have any like flash tips, especially for on-camera flash, put them down in the comments so other people can read them, so I can read them too. Sometimes I like to learn from you guys as well. Not sometimes, all the time, but it does help everybody, right? So, you know, and if you guys have any other questions, right, I do focus mainly on wedding photography because that is my niche. That's what I'm good at. But if you guys have questions about portraits, if you guys have questions about like event photography, you know, a lot of my earlier work was shooting, you know, musician recitals, like classical music recitals and events, graduation stuff, like all that stuff, you know, feel free to ask, and, you know, I'll make a video on it. Maybe I'll make like a real life example, you know, give someone a free shoot and show you guys how it works. So other than that, I'm going to leave you guys to have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much for clicking on the video. Again, my name is Jose. Thank you all for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, whatever you guys want to do. Stay tuned for more videos. There's a little bit more variety coming with some photography content still as the basis. I'm going to let you guys go. Have a good one, and peace.